Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to me to welcome you here at this public lecture by Steven Pinker. Before I ask him to give his talk, I would just like to briefly give you an idea of where this public lecture is coming from. We just spent 2 days in the wonderful surroundings of King's College talking about the question of how to reduce global levels of violence by 50% over the next 30 years, which sounds like an utterly ridiculous idea, but it was a very interesting group of people. The conference was organized jointly by the Institute of Criminology and the World Health Organization, and it was supported by the Optimus Foundation, whose support we greatly appreciate, and who has made this meeting possible and who has made this lecture possible. When we started thinking about this topic, it sounded like a slightly extravagant topic that just some few academics would think about. But over this year, this has become a really important issue. In May this year, the World Health Assembly adopted a path-breaking resolution which said the World Health Organization has a mandate to reduce violence across the globe, especially violence against women and violence against children. And we're right now in the global discussions around the post-2015 Global Development Agenda. So some of you may know that in 2000, the United Nations adopted the Millennium Development Goals, which set a number of goals. Violence was not amongst them. But right now, there is discussions going on about whether the United Nations would set a goal for creating more peaceful societies, and the idea is to also think about giving specific targets. So this conference brought together people who just thought creatively about whether this is a meaningful goal. I think we all agreed that this is a meaningful goal. Brought in different perspectives. We had many academics from low and middle income countries, because we thought this is a particularly important group to bring into this meeting and to have a creative discussion. What we also wanted to happen is to take the message that we believe we can actually do this to a wider public and to share some of the ideas with you. And we thought that nobody would be better to achieve this goal than to have Steven Pinker talk here about the past, the present, and the future of violence. Steven Pinker is professor of psychology at Harvard University. Probably many of you know about his work. He's produced work on a large number of topics. The Blank Slate may be a book that you may know, and recently the book about the better angels of our nature, where he claims, and he says, well, I shouldn't say he claims, because some small part of it is based on my own work. So he rightly says, I should probably say, he rightly says that at least some manifestations of violence have declined over the past, not all of them, and it's a rocky road, but there is some possibility that we can achieve a substantial reduction in violence if we do the right thing. And that's a message that we want to share with policymakers, with global organizations, and to work towards the right strategies to actually achieve this goal. So, without further ado, I would very much like to ask Steven Pinker to give his talk.
Thank you very much, Manuel. It's a tremendous honor, and I might add a wonderful birthday present to be able to address a conference on reducing global violence. And so I thank Manuel Eisner, the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, the World Health Organization, and the Optimus Foundation for making it possible. Now, the idea of reducing violence by 50% over the next 30 years might sound like the kind of thing you might hear out of the mouth of Yoko Ono after her third hit on a bong at Woodstock. But I hope to convince you that, in fact, it is not a romantic, utopian, unrealistic goal, but that given the history of violence and the psychology of violence, this is actually a completely attainable, practical, utilitarian goal. So let me start with violence in the past, and probably the simplest generation about violence in the past is there used to be a lot more of it. And a good place to start is with the research of our host, Manuel Eisner, who stunned many people, including me, when he published a number of estimates of homicide. Fortunately, people have long been interested in corpses and missing persons, and so we have records of homicide that go back literally 800 years. On this graph, which I adapted from Manuel, he plotted on a logarithmic scale from 1/10 of a homicide per 100,000 population per year to 1 to 10 to 100, from the year 1200 to the year 2000, every estimate of homicide in England that he could find. And as you can see, there's a massive decline, so that a contemporary Englishman has about 1/35 the chance of being murdered as his medieval ancestors. Even more amazingly, this is not just something that happened in England, but it can be seen pretty much anywhere. You can find data that go back far enough, and Manuel has also shown that it's true of Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland, and Scandinavia. And here is a average that I plotted of those 5 regions. Since then, this is about 11 years old, Manuel has added many more data sets to this collection. Well, how seriously should we take the historical decline of violence? Is it somehow a methodological artifact or some statistical fluke? Well, Manuel himself has presented a great deal of auxiliary data to show that it probably is not, but I'm going to perhaps soften you up to accept his conclusion by another route, namely that the decline of homicide is one of many declines in violence in human history. Stranger things have happened. For example, let's consider some of the ways in which crime was controlled a few hundred years ago in medieval Europe. Techniques of behavior modification such as breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing in half, and impalement. But in a remarkable development concentrated in during the European Enlightenment, the second half of the 18th century, country after country abolished the use of torture as a form of criminal punishment, including the United States in its famous prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which actually took place in the middle of a worldwide process. Another example, even when the death penalty was made far more humane and quick and painless, it used to be applied to an astonishing variety of crimes. In 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child aged 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, the number of capital crimes had been reduced to 4. Now, the death penalty itself, of course, has been abolished in most Western democracies. This timeline shows that most of the abolitions were concentrated in the 20th century. But the blue timeline, which shows the number of European countries that actually carry out executions, show that well before politicians got around to striking capital punishment from the law books, their citizens had pretty much lost their taste for putting people to death. And on average, 50 years elapsed between the last actual execution and the time the politicians got around to abolishing it. Now, I mentioned that that most Western democracies have abolished capital punishment. My own adopted country, the United States, is an outlier in this regard, as it is, by the way, in many measures of violence. But even in the United States, the same trend seems to be sweeping over the country. This graph shows the rate of executions in the United States from 1625 to the first few years of the 21st century. And as you can see, there's been a massive decline. Nowadays in the United States, there are something like 40 executions a year in a country that has almost 16,000 homicides per year. Also abolished during this slice of time were witch hunts, religious persecution like burning heretics, dueling among men of honor, blood sports like bear baiting, debtors' prisons, and most famously of all, slavery. Now, slavery used to be legal everywhere on earth. No one seemed to think there was anything particularly wrong with it. The Bible had no problem with slavery. So-called democratic Athens was a slave-holding society. But beginning during the time of the European Enlightenment, in the second half of the 18th century, there was a trickle of abolitions which grew into a flood which eventually swept over the entire world. And for the last 30 years, we've been living through a unique period in human history in which slavery is not legal anywhere on the planet. Well, what about war? Few people are aware that we have seen not one, but two qualitative kinds of decline of war. The first has been called the long peace, and the second I've christened the new peace. Now, here's a graph that shows you the rate of death in war in the 20th century and the first few years of the 21st. And there's no mistaking the fact that there were two horrific spikes of bloodletting concentrated around the time of the two world wars. It was very natural in the decades after the Second World War to extrapolate as follows. Well, World War I killed 15 million people, and World War II killed 50 million people, and now we've got nuclear weapons, so it's obvious what's going to happen next. And I'm old enough to have grown up with confident predictions. I shouldn't say confident, certain predictions by the world's experts that global thermonuclear war between the US and the USSR was inevitable. Needless to say, it never happened, and it can't happen because there is no USSR. More generally, you can see that after these two spikes, there was not a crescendo of escalating violence, but rather the rate of death in war kind of has been bouncing along the floor for quite some time. In particular, the process called the long peace refers to a number of, I think, what historians will consider astonishing facts about the last 68 years. Namely, there's a historically unusual decline, in fact, unprecedented decline in interstate war. That is the subtype of war that has a government against a government. Good old-fashioned classic wars. In fact, the most interesting statistic from this period is zero. There were, as I mentioned, contrary to every expert prediction, no wars between the US and the USSR. No nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki, again, contrary to every expert prediction. There have been no two wars between any great powers since the end of the Korean War in 1953. It used to be that the world's biggest, most powerful states were constantly at each other's throats. That abruptly went to zero in 1953. No wars between Western European countries. Again, this almost seems like a banal, obvious fact, like who would ever expect, France and Germany to fight a war. But needless to say, this is a historically unusual state of affairs, and I've calculated that in the half millennium prior to 1945, Western European countries alone started 2 new wars a year for 600 years. In 1945, that went to zero. And there have been no wars between developed countries. The rich countries, pick the 40 countries with the highest GDP, they have not fought a war with each other since 1945. Now, even less appreciated is a development that I call the new peace, which is that since 1990, globally, there have been fewer and shorter civil wars, the second major category of war. So the process that began with great powers, rich countries, Western European countries, is starting to spread to the rest of the world. Now, there admittedly have been, in the post-World War II period, a bulge of civil wars that have kind of taken the place of the old-fashioned interstate wars. But the thing is that civil wars are far less deadly than traditional interstate wars. And let me show you with a graph what the trajectory of war has been since 1946. Following data sets from organizations in Uppsala, Oslo, and Vancouver. This graph divides war into 4 categories. It's a stacked layer graph, by the way, where the thickness of each layer corresponds to the rate of death in one category of war, and the height of the height of the entire stack corresponds to the total rate of death from all categories of war combined. Well, here we have the rate of death in colonial wars, where a European empire tried to hang on to a colony. That went to zero in the 1970s, and there are no more traditional colonies. Here we have the rate of death from interstate wars, the good old-fashioned wars between two countries, with spikes for Korea, Vietnam, and Iran, Iraq. Here we have the rate of death from purely internal civil wars and from internationalized civil wars, which is when another country butts in, usually to on one side or another, usually to help a government defend itself against rebels or insurgents. And so you can see there has not been a monotonic, to say nothing of a linear decline. It's been a roller coaster, but it's a roller coaster whose trajectory is unmistakably downward, culminating in the first decade in the 21st century in an unprecedentedly low rate of war globally of all categories combined. Let me just quickly run through some other recent declines of violence that, again, I find people are completely unaware of. In the United States, and there are similar curves for Britain, the rate of rape has fallen by about 75% since its peak in the early 70s. Domestic violence has also plunged, both for female victims and male victims. Corporal punishment, the paddling or strapping of students in schools in the United States has gone considerably down. Attitudes toward spanking and smacking and other forms of corporal punishment are down in every public opinion poll that asks people whether it's acceptable for a parent to smack a child. Hunting is down, and there's been a sharp decline in the number of motion pictures in which animals were harmed. Well, let me now turn to violence in the present. How do we explain that violence has declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? Could it be that human nature has changed and have people's inclinations toward violence literally been bred out of them? Well, I actually consider that possibility to be rather unlikely for a number of reasons. One is that many declines in violence are simply too recent and too rapid to have been products of standard Darwinian natural selection, changes in gene frequencies over generations. For example, since 1945, Germany went from the probably history's most warlike, bellicose, militant society to the history's most pacifist society. That's just been a couple of generations, way too fast for there to have been any change in gene frequencies. Certain violent phenomena like lynching, rape, and spousal abuse have plunged again over a span of decades or even years. The 1990s homicide decline, which most dramatic in the United States, but seen in almost every country in which it's looked for, where homicide has declined by 50% in 10 years. That's not even one generation. Since we know that there have to be environmental causes of behavior change that were sufficient to power those declines, the most parsimonious explanation is that changes in the environment were sufficient to explain all the declines. That's not a definitive argument, but that is, we have no need for a hypothesis that human nature has changed. Also, there is plenty of evidence that we continue to harbor the same violent impulses that our ancestors did. We continue to see violence in young children. In fact, here's a trick question. What is the most violent age in human life? Most people would say, oh, it's got to be between, say, 15 and 30. The correct answer is 2. When a majority of toddlers hit, bite, and kick, we don't tend to categorize that as violence because a 2-year-old just can't do all that much damage. But if 2-year-olds had guns, then our picture would be very different. These are data from Richard Tremblay. And grown-up kids continue to take tremendous pleasure in vicarious violence, such as murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, ice hockey, and movies starring a certain ex-governor of California. And then there are homicidal fantasies. A number of social psychologists have posed the following question to their subjects: have you ever fantasized about killing someone? And the results are that about 15% of women and a third of men frequently fantasize about killing people. And about 60% of women and 3/4 of men at least occasionally fantasize about killing people. Well, what do these data tell us about human nature? They tell us that 25% of men are liars. A more likely possibility is that human nature is and always has been extraordinarily complex and has always comprised both brain systems that incline us toward violence and brain systems that inhibit us from violence, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, which I stole as the title of my book. And what's changed is that historical circumstances have increasingly favored the violence-inhibiting systems. Now, note that I say brain systems for violence because a fundamental discovery in the neurobiology and psychology of aggression is that aggression comes in more than one flavor. And neither violence nor violence comes from a single motive or brain system. And just a simple demonstration of this, apparent to ethologists and neuroscientists for a long time, is that, and verifiable for any of you who have a pet cat, is that when your cat stalks prey, it will keep its body close to the ground, silently stalk a potential prey, a mouse or a cockroach on the floor, and then quickly pounce and dispatch the prey with a quiet bite. But when a male cat faces another male cat, then the behavior is quite different. Then you get the cat making itself look as big as possible, erecting its fur, hissing and yowling, and if it comes to a fight, it will be, as we say, a cat fight. The fur will fly. And indeed, the brain systems for predation and for male against male aggression are completely separable in the brain. They run off different hormones. They're neuroanatomically separate. Humans are more complicated than cats, and we have even more systems for violence. I'm going to identify four sources of that. By sources, I mean psychological and ultimately neurobiological systems that modulate violence. Well, the first and most obvious is a brain system that some neurobiologists call the rage system. It extends from the midbrain through the hypothalamus to the amygdala. And rage is a primitive response to pain, fear, or frustration. Its evolutionary function is to neutralize an immediate threat with a furious struggle and an intimidating noise and display. In mild forms, we see it in human beings in the form of computer repair known as percussive maintenance. And in extreme forms, we see it in violent outbursts by individuals and, more chillingly, in rampages of the sort that you see in riots, pogroms, police outbursts, and other forms of spontaneous collective violence. Second, there's instrumental or exploitative violence, where violence is just used as a means to an end. You harm an obstacle that just happens to stand in the way of something that you want. And in fact, it's rather dubious to classify this as a kind of violence at all. It's certainly a violence from the point of view of the victim, but from the point of view of the perpetrator, it's just instrumental action. It's no different from any other manipulation of the environment to bring about a goal. When I slap a mosquito, I don't really consider it violence from my point of view. I don't hate the mosquito. I'm not angry. I just don't want to get bitten. But if you were to ask the mosquito, she would have a very different opinion. Some examples of instrumental violence include predation, plunder, conquest, rape, the elimination of rivals, and the preemptive removal of threats. Third, a very different form of violence is dominance. We even have expressions like knock a chip off your shoulder, to draw a line in the sand, where we identify some utterly meaningless symbolic event that can be a trigger for violence to underscore the fact that there isn't anything tangible at stake. Dominance is established by confrontations to establish relative strength. whereupon the weaker cedes any contested resource to the stronger. The obvious evolutionary function is that if the outcome of a fight could be predicted in advance based on the relative strength or resolve of the antagonists, then it's in both of their interests not to have the fight. The loser for obvious reasons, but a winner could get hurt in a fight as well. If the outcome is a foregone conclusion, don't bother having the fight. You have the confrontation to establish the relative strength and resolve. We see this in individuals in the whole phenomenon, now originally from primatology, now in common parlance of the alpha male, often established by the sport called competitive distance urination, and characteristically engaged in by the gender with the most suitable equipment to compete. But we also see it at the group level in contests between ethnic groups, races, nations, or religions, which can engage in both displays of strength and actual battles for supremacy at the level of group against group, with a psychology very similar to that of an individual against individual. Finally, there's revenge, where you retaliate against a harm by physically harming the perpetrator of harm. There is a sense when revenge is exacted that it is not just permissible, but justified and indeed mandatory. You can't let someone get away with it. The ultimate function is to deter the harm doer and others like him who catch wind of the punishment. And examples of how this leads to violence include vendettas, blood feuds, rough justice, and cruel punishments. Now, having gone through those four systems, I think each rooted in our biology that can lead to violence, an important remark is that these are what biologists call facultative adaptations. Namely, they're environmentally sensitive. They're not hydraulic or homeostatic urges. That is something that builds up and you just have to release periodically. So in that regard, one could say that the need for food, water, sleep, and perhaps sex have this homeostatic component. That is, you do without them for a certain amount of time. You want them more and more. You're willing to do more and more desperate things to get them. On the other hand, that is not the way that all biologically evolved motives work. There are many that need quite particular environmental triggers, such as, for example, shivering. Now, it's pretty clear that shivering is an innate response, but you could go the rest of your life without shivering if you never get cold. It's not like, oh, I haven't shivered in a few hours, I have to get it out of my system. And there are many examples like this. Sexual jealousy, falling head over heels in love, it may never happen to you again. And violent motives like rage, predation, dominance, and revenge are also facultative. That is, I think there are good arguments that it really is part of our evolved biological nature. That does not mean that we are doomed to get it out of our system, that we need some form of release. Given changes in environment, these systems may never be triggered again in the lifetime of an individual. Okay, so I've talked about four systems for violence. What do we have on the other side to counter them? What are the better angels of our nature? Well, there's self-control. These are systems that can anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit violent impulses. I mentioned that 75% of men have homicidal fantasies. Needless to say, far fewer than 75% of men act on their homicidal fantasies. For that, we have self-control to thank. This is not just some kind of mysterious angel hovering on one shoulder, but it's increasingly apparent that it can be tied to particular systems in the brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, such as the frontal pole at the tippy tip of the brain, the orbital frontal cortex, that is the part that sits above your orbits, that is your eyeballs, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for different aspects of self-control. There's empathy, particularly empathy in the sense of sympathetic concern, that is, feeling another's pain. The original evolutionary function of empathy most likely was to bond a mother with her offspring, but also close genetically related kin, and by extension in humans, close friends and allies, those with whom we have some mutualistic common interest. An important fact about empathy, often neglected in the many bestsellers on the age of empathy and our empathic civilization and so on, is that contrary to, I think, a rather romantic view of empathy, empathy is not an automatic reflex. And the discovery of so-called mirror neurons, neurons that fire when you do something or you see someone else do something, contrary to popular belief, does not mean that we automatically feel the pain of anyone whose behavior we witness. A great deal of research has shown that our empathy response can easily be turned on or off, and in fact switched into counter-empathy or schadenfreude, depending on kinship, on similarity. You tend to empathize with people like you, not so much with people not like you. With solidarity, are they on your team or on the other team? And cuteness. Cute little fuzzy animals are targets of ecological protection. Ugly species can go to hell. Sad to say. Third, there's the moral sense, a set of norms and taboos that regulate just what you do or don't do if you consider yourself a decent member of your society. Now, there's not just one source of moral norms, but research in moral psychology has shown that there's a whole inventory which different cultures emphasize to different extents. There's loyalty to the tribe, deference to authority, safeguarding purity, enforcing fairness, preventing harm, and providing care. Now, a crucial thing about the moral sense is that, like empathy, it is easy to romanticize it and think that the world doesn't have enough morality, and only if we had more of it, violence would go down. I think that's exactly backwards. The world has far too much morality, and morality of the wrong form can actually increase violence, although if it's properly directed, it can also decrease it. Well, what do I mean by that? No one has done an exact count. It's probably impossible to do. But if you were to tally up all of the deaths, violent deaths that were caused by moralistic motives as opposed to purely instrumental motives, that is, people eliminating other people because there's something tangible that they want, some resource, I think it would be strongly stacked in favor of the moralistic violence. So if you consider the number of homicides that are not over a disputed physical resource, but as a result of what the criminologists call self-help justice. Now, self-help justice has nothing to do with Oprah or women who love too much or anything like that. Self-help justice means someone has committed what you consider to be a wrong against yourself or someone else, and you're engaging in a kind of rough justice by punishing them yourself. Suicidal rampage killings, the proverbial disgruntled postal worker or the high school shooters, by definition, they're not getting anything out of it except because they kill themselves. Religious and revolutionary wars, executions for victimless crimes like blasphemy and drug possession and homosexuality, the torture of heretics, burning of witches, lynchings in the United States, imprisonment of homosexuals, honor killing of unchaste sisters and daughters, terrorist attacks, ideological genocides. I think if you were to try to tally up how many people died from all these causes over a given period of time, they would vastly outnumber the victims of amoral predation and exploitation. So the important proviso is that the human moral sense can reduce violence only when it is actually radically contracted from its traditional domains and centered on fairness, the prevention of harm, and the provision of care. So we need to work very hard to make the world less moral. Finally, there is reason. I'm a cognitive psychologist, so I like reason. The deployment of cognitive processes to engage in objective, detached analysis. Human cognition is an open-ended, combinatorial, generative system. That is, we don't select from a finite inventory of thoughts, but we can combine them and multiply them and compose an unlimited number of complicated thoughts out of simple thoughts and share them with language. And thanks to our being endowed with intelligent cognitive processes of reason, we can treat violence as a problem to be solved. And that's a feature of our psychology that I'll return to toward the end of the talk. Okay, well, now the question is, given I've spoken about the empirical phenomenon of historical declines, the psychology of violence. How do we bring the history and psychology back together? Which circumstances bring out our better angels and stay our hands before they can commit acts of bloodshed? Well, one possibility is that Hobbes got it right when he called for a Leviathan as the ultimate violence reduction technique. That is a state or government with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And the idea is that a state and a judicial system with a monopoly on violence can reduce violence by neutralizing the incentive for exploitative or predatory attack by penalizing an aggressor and therefore canceling out his anticipated gain. That can calm everyone down, because the thing about a Leviathan is that it doesn't just incentivize you to refrain from aggression, but you also know that it's incentivizing your neighbor to not to engage in aggression. And as a result, it reduces the temptation for preemptive attack, to do it to them before they do it to you, which gives them all the more reason to do it to you before you do it to them so that they don't do it to you. For deterrence, that is to broadcast the news that you are so mean and tough and macho that you will retaliate at any cost. And of course, the need to carry out vengeance after the fact. And by outsourcing your revenge to a disinterested third party, you also circumvent the self-serving biases that social psychologists have shown that human beings are prone to. Namely, in any human dispute, no matter how trivial, both sides sincerely believe that their opponent's attacks are unprovoked aggression out of the blue, whereas their attacks are justified retaliation after the fact. So you always have one side counting an even number of harms and thinking that justice has been done, another side counting an odd number of harms and figuring there's still a score to be settled. If you have some disinterested third party keeping score, then that cycle can be nipped in the bud. A second technology for reducing violence is the theory of du commerce, gentle commerce, from the number of Enlightenment thinkers, according to which plunder is a zero-sum game. The victim's loss equals the aggressor's gain, but trade is a positive-sum game. As they say, everybody wins if you trade your surpluses. And as technology, such as better roads and contracts and ways of moving merchandise and legal institutions, allow goods and ideas to be traded over longer distances among larger groups of people and at lower cost, it becomes cheaper to buy things than to steal them, and other people become more valuable to you alive than dead. And this could work both at the individual level of individual burglaries and robberies. I remember when I was a college student that friends of mine in New York said that they had to constantly worry that their apartments would be broken into by thieves who wanted to steal their clock radios. Now, a clock radio then was a luxury good. Now it would be absurd to risk any kind of detection or arrest by trying to steal a clock radio because they're so ridiculously cheap. At the national level, international level, as Robert Wright pointed out in his book Non-Zero, among the many reasons that I think we should not bomb the Japanese is that they built my minivan. A third mechanism by which our better angels can be brought in is the term called the expanding circle by the philosopher Peter Singer, but the idea goes back to Charles Darwin. Namely, that humans have been equipped by evolution with a sense of empathy, as I mentioned before. But as I also mentioned, we deploy it by default only to a narrow circle of friends and family and cute little baby animals. But over the course of history, one can see the circle of empathy expanding to include the village, then the clan, the tribe, the nation, other races, both sexes, children, and perhaps eventually other species. Now, this just begs the question of why the circle expanded, and a plausible answer is technologies of increased cosmopolitanism. That is, ways that encourage people and ideas to mix so that it's harder to think of other people as being unlike you and therefore to dehumanize them. Technologies that facilitate travel, the consumption of history, literature, drama, and journalism. A final mechanism, I'm sorry, I'm tending to see the world in fours, but a fourth possible historical mechanism for bringing out our better angels is the escalator of reason. That is, as literacy expands, as education expands, as there is a marketplace of ideas for public discourse, there's reason to believe that people think more abstractly and more universally. This will inevitably encourage people to rise above their parochial vantage point. That makes it harder to privilege your interests over others just because you're you and they're not. It encourages people to step back and recognize the futility of cycles of violence, and increasingly to see violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. And indeed, there are a large number of products of cognition that may have reduced violence. We tend not to think of them as gadgets like clock radios or iPhones, but they are kind of institutional gadgets, like, as I mentioned, government, like limits on government. Humans are always poised between the violence of anarchy and the violence of tyranny. Probably the violence of anarchy is worse in terms of the sheer probability of getting killed, but governments can kill a lot of people too, including their own citizens. One can think of democracy as a way of getting the greatest advantages of government with the fewest disadvantages. Namely, you fine-tune and tweak the mechanisms of government so that it is empowered to implement exactly as much violence as is needed to prevent greater violence and no more. An infrastructure of commerce, as I've mentioned. The European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize the year before last because its idea was if you make it easy for France and Germany to sell each other coal and steel, they're less likely to go to war. And in my view, that Nobel Prize was deserved. Measured responses to aggression. Instead of lashing out with the full fury when a harm has been done, you figure out how little response you can get away with. We see this at the international level in terms of, say, economic sanctions in response to an infraction as opposed to an all-out invasion. And we see it in punishment of individuals, where instead of breaking someone on the wheel for stealing a cabbage, we might put him in jail for a month or give him probation or make him feel bad, but not as bad as he would feel if we broke him on the wheel. And the general propagation of nonviolence itself as an abstract ideal, competing with other systems of belief and value. And this may actually feed back into a loop where institutions that were originally implemented out of nerdy, abstract, cold calculation might feed back to influence our other better angels. If you've got police walking the beat, it's easier to exert self-control. You don't have to retaliate with violence after someone disses you, after an insult. In a state of anarchy, you might, because a failure to retaliate would be a sign that you are a weakling and will be exploited thereafter. But if you've got hired muscle, namely the government, to do it for you, you yourself don't bear the burden of lashing out reflexively, and self-control starts to pay off. And for similar reasons, empathy, norms, and taboos can then make unconscious and visceral behaviors that originally were designed by rational means. Okay, part 3, the future of violence. And here is a frequently asked question that I get particularly in the last couple of months. Were the aughts, the double zeros, the first decade of the 21st century, a fluke? I published an article in 2007 and then a book in 2011, which went to press in 2000. Manuel Eisner, our host, published a number of articles in the first decade of the 21st century. There were a number of other books by also celebrating the decline of violence across many scales. But were we all just capitalizing on a random fluctuation? Is history cyclical? Were we lucky enough to just pick a trough post hoc and celebrate it as if it was a systematic development? In particular, there's a question that I often get from journalists whose attention span is measured in weeks at best. Have recent events like Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, provinces of Mexico like Chihuahua and Juarez, the ascension of ISIS, reversed the decline of violence? That is, should we just throw all these books and articles out because history has come back with a vengeance? Or, to put it more strongly, is the world order falling apart? So here I believe that this is a the kind of thinking that is all too tempting if you base your view of the world on the news. You really need to count and just look at the graphs. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs where I've put a vertical line, a red line, at the point at which the books were closed on the Better Angels of Our Nature. This would be 2009. And just to show you what the world trend has been in the last 4 years, to see whether we, having hit bottom, we have, oops, I should stop doing that. We have just rebounded right back up. So I'll start with homicide in the United States, which since the books were closed just keeps going down and down, despite the Great Recession, which once again all the experts predicted, unemployment, inequality, crime's going to come skyrocketing back. Didn't happen. It kept drooping. And the same is true in most countries for which at least I have been able to find data in the last couple of weeks. Here's Canada, same thing. Whoops, what happened to the UK? Oh, sorry. Anyway, the UK shows a similar trend. There's been a decline of crime in the UK. It's kind of wiggled around a little bit in the last 4 years, but nothing serious. Here's my best estimate of the rate for the entire world, combining 4 different estimates from the year 2000 to the present. Once again, nothing special happened in 2009. Now, of course, there are some parts of the world in Central America and other places where, in the Caribbean, Latin America, where partly because of the drug trade and gangs, violence did increase. But it would be a mistake to think that this represents a dramatic reversal of the historical trends. Here are data for Mexico, most of which, by the way, are which indeed went up even before Better Angels was published, mostly because of a certain number of areas in Mexico. It was not a nationwide phenomenon. But even there, you see that the trend is starting to reverse, as it is for other hotspots for violence that have been in the news, which those of us attending the conference have heard about. Notoriously violent places like Sao Paulo and Rio in Brazil have seen declines, somewhat dramatic, but sometimes dramatic. But even then, one has to put into perspective the bounce that occurred starting in around the year 2006. Let's zoom back for Mexico and look at the history of violence in Mexico to see how big even this bounce was in the scheme of things. Here's a graph that shows homicide in Mexico from 1930 to 2010. And the bounce is certainly noticeable, but it is a tiny fraction of the decline that Mexico enjoyed in the decades prior to that local reversal. What about violence against women? That is thankfully in the news. It's a subject of increased attention. In the United States, there are statistics going around about how many female college students have been raped, and one might imagine that we've recently seen a huge swelling in the rate of rape in the United States. That turns out to be false, that as I mentioned, rates of rape for many decades, and that fall has been continuing, not reversed in the last 4 years. Same is true of intimate partner violence. This is a slide from David Finkelhor, another conference presenter, where we've seen the decline has by no means reversed. I'm going to give you a quote from a paper of David, who's in the audience, of a 2014 survey where he notes 50 trends in exposure examined. I'm sorry, I'm talking now about violence against children, not violence against women. As far as violence against children are concerned, there were 27 significant declines and no significant increases between 2003 and 2011. This is despite all of the moral panic about bullying and cyberbullying and school shootings and so on. Sure, there are incidents, but if you actually plot them over time, they have all declined, including assault victimization, bullying, and sexual victimization. Here are some other graphs from David. Here we see the decline of physical abuse of children, again, has not reversed in the last few years, the decline of sexual abuse in children. Well, what about war? As of 2014, all the developments called the long peace have not been reversed. We still have not seen any wars between great powers. Indeed, for all the talk of the crisis in Ukraine, the overwhelming dynamic is that the big countries do not want to get into a war with each other. Even the most hawkish of American hawks that have been making President Obama miserable with their constant criticism, not a single one has said, hey, we should punish Russia by going to war with them. That is just not on the table. Needless to say, almost exactly 100 years ago, that kind of, the mindset was completely different, and of course the result was World War I. World leaders are not even considering the kind of action that could bring a return of World War I. Still no wars between any two wealthy countries, no wars in Western Europe, no wars that result in a state going out of existence by conquest. That has not happened since 1945. No wars with nuclear weapons, of course. Now, what about the smaller wars, like those in Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, and Gaza? Well, look, first let's just count them, how many there are. And here's a graph that shows the same four categories of war that I displayed earlier, that is colonial, interstate, civil, and internationalized civil. And here is the decline in the number of civil wars that began with the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Empire. And in the last few years, number of wars has been bouncing around, but there has not actually been an increase in the number of them. By the way, here, for the point of this graph, a war is counted as a organized conflict with a government on at least one side that kills as few as 25 people. Now, that of course can be misleading because some of those wars are just don't affect a whole lot of people. What if we count up the deaths? Well, here's the graph that I showed you before. And now I'm going to update it from the last year that I included in the book to the most recent data available. 2013 is the most recent complete year. And here you can see what happens to the war death curve. So it absolutely goes up. There is no doubt that because of the civil war in Syria, there's been an increase in war deaths and also Iraq. Ukraine and Gaza are not included in this because the books on this end in 2013. But the civil war in Syria was certainly in full swing in 2013. And indeed, there is a uptick, but it is completely tiny compared to the massive decline that the world has enjoyed since World War II. So the answer is yes, there has been an increase in violence. No, it has not undone the mind-boggling progress of the last two-thirds of a century. What about democratization? Because of the various crackdowns by Putin, situation in Venezuela, Mugabe, other countries that have been in the news for their retreat of democracy, you see a number of pundits saying that the great democratization wave of the 1980s and 90s has been reversed. Well, again, let's go to the data, not to one or two examples in the news. The blue line shows the number of countries that are democracies. The red line, the number of autocracies. They reversed in 1989, switched places. Since then, there have been more democracies than autocracies. And as of 2009, there's been a deceleration in that trend. There's not been anything close to a reversal, contrary to the anecdote-driven pundits. Finally, what about violence by states? I mentioned that capital punishment has been in decline in the United States. There have been, again, some highly publicized botched executions in Mississippi where they couldn't get the needle in to kill the pathetic prisoner with the toxic cocktail. And again, you could think they're in the news, therefore there must be more of them. But in fact, the worldwide trend toward abolition is continuing, perhaps at a slightly decelerated rate. But since 2009, there have been a number of countries who have abolished capital punishment for all crimes. In the United States, again, an outlier, but clearly influenced by this worldwide trend. Since the number of states with capital punishment has been continually decreasing, just in the last 4 years, 3 additional states have abolished the death penalty. The rate of execution in the United States, which I mentioned has gone down, has continued to go down in the last 4 years. And indeed, if you want to extrapolate, which of course is always foolhardy, but if one were, the global trend would have the death penalty abolished from the face of the earth by the year 2026, if current trends continue. So over the last 5 years, no, the world is not becoming more violent. Civil war is the only category of violence that shows even a small uptick, and that's concentrated pretty much in Syria and Iraq, which are responsible for almost that entire reversal. But for every other trend, it has continued its downward trajectory, and recent events have not reversed the declines in violence in the last 20, 50, or 1,000 years. Now, why should there be such a discrepancy between perception and reality? Not just over the last 5 years, but just about the overall course of human history. I've done surveys and asked people for various places and types of violence, comparing the past to the present, which do you think is more violent? A majority of people think that the world has gotten more violent, and as I've tried to persuade you, the opposite is the case. Well, I think it's a combination of a phenomenon from cognitive psychology called the availability bias or availability heuristic, discovered 40 years ago by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, according to which the human brain judges probability by the ease of recalling examples from memory. And so if you want to know how common people think something is, how easy does an example spring to mind? How likely are you to get eaten by a shark? Well, if there was a shark attack in the news last week, you'll think it's very likely. If it's been a number of years since then, you won't think it's likely. Now, if you combine that with the nature of news, news is about things that happen. It's not about things that don't happen. If something blows up, it's news. If something doesn't blow up, it's not news. It's even worse than that because, of course, on top of that inherent bias, there's a saying in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. People love to read about violence. I mean, we pay for simulated violence in our entertainment. We pay for real violence in our news. But even if there wasn't the bleed-lead bias, simply the fact that peace, nonviolence, and so on are not events. They're the absence of events. You never see a reporter standing on in Mozambique or in Ulster or in Vietnam and saying, well, here I am and no war has broken out today. Although it is significant that no war has broken out in those places, but that's exactly the kind of thing that the news does not mention. Well, you put them together, and since as long as rates of violence have not fallen to zero, then there are always enough violent incidents to fill the news, and people will always think that the world is a violent place. In fact, as the capacity to gather news increases, there are several billion smartphones in the world. Each one of them makes a person a real-time reporter. You can upload color, video footage of anything that happens anywhere to the web, so we know about violence where it occurs. People are going to think it's increased even when it does decrease. Well, what about predictions? Well, there's a saying in social science that social scientists should never try to predict the future. We have enough trouble predicting the past. But nonetheless, our generous host, Manuel Eisner, has been kind of goading me since the book was published to kind of go out on a limb and make some predictions. You know, he says to me, not in these words, stop being such a weenie. Come on, scientists are supposed to make predictions, make your hypotheses falsifiable. What do you think is going to happen? And so I'm going to go out on a limb, which I have not done in the past. I was quite reticent in Better Angels of Our Nature, with the proviso that you should take these predictions with something of a grain of salt. Whenever experts have made predictions in the past, most of them have been embarrassed to humiliated to utterly discredited. So with that in mind, these are my hunches. Take them for as you will. And with the other proviso that stuff happens. Things can come out of the blue which no one could have predicted, and that might happen. But barring unlikely catastrophes, which is a big proviso, here's some thoughts. One is that some forms of violence, once abolished, stay abolished. So this is a way of at least motivating my hunches by looking to what has happened in the past. It is simply not true that all categories of violence are cyclical. There have been irreversible or pretty close to irreversible changes. A good example is human sacrifice, throwing a virgin into a volcano and similar acts to placate angry gods. Now, every civilization, major civilization in history, practiced human sacrifice. Every major civilization at some point thought the better of it and abolished it. Once it's abolished, it tends to stay abolished. Cannibalism, very common in human prehistory. I don't think it's going to make a systematic comeback. Legal slavery, notwithstanding the existence of human trafficking, which is nowhere near as horrendous as the institution of slavery. I don't think we're going to see the recurrence of slave auctions in public squares anytime soon. Debtors' prisons, I think, unlikely to make a comeback. Public torture executions, are we going to start breaking people on the wheel again? I'm going to go out on a limb and say no, or I don't think so. Now, there are other categories that are, I think, less certain because they can't be eliminated by the stroke of a pen or a decision to just not do that anymore. They depend on aggregate behavior by literally billions of individuals. But I think there is some reasonable basis for expecting the declines to continue. Within functioning states, I think that we have every reason to believe that homicide and other violent crimes like rape and assault will continue to decline. I haven't specifically called attention to this, but in the 1960s, there was a reversal of the centuries-long decline of homicide. Some people call it the Great 60s Freakout, where starting in the mid-60s and continuing through to the early 90s, the homicide rate more than doubled before falling back down to earth. At the time, those of us who lived through it will remember commentators saying that it's just an intractable problem. We've lost control of the cities. They will forever after be hellholes. Let's move to gated communities. We don't know how to reduce crime. We never will reduce it. This is the new normal. That turned out to be wrong. We now know that the 60s, 70s, and 80s were the anomaly. There are ways of bringing rates of crime down. And I frankly don't think that citizens of a democracy, or for that matter, a halfway decent functioning government, are going to put up with a repeat of the 60s. We just enjoy life too much with low rates of crime. We know that we don't have to tolerate high rates of crime. So my hunch is that the rates will stay low. Forms of violent punishment, such as still remain, I think, like capital punishment and corporal punishment, I think will continue to decline. Punishment of victimless acts like homosexuality, like prostitution, like drug possession, I think one can see a momentum against them. And the violence against women, as I've mentioned, we can certainly see it in developed countries. In developing countries, not so much. But on the other hand, there are a number of aspirational statements and commitments to reduce violence against women worldwide. Now, you might write them off as, well, they're just words, they're hot air. Sure, you can declare anything you want. What does that have to do with reality? But in fact, I think a reasonable case can be made that often, I don't want to say always, but often, aspirational declarations that countries have agreed to become a reality and can be surprisingly secure. Oh, I'm sorry. So before I get to those, the declarations against domestic violence and rape in conflict have received the assent of many, many countries. But, for example, the slave trade and slavery itself, before they were abolished, there were aspirational declarations. It took a while to actually be implemented, but they turned out not to be hot air. Piracy and privateering. We now think of piracy as things that desperately poor Somali pirates do, and if you see, what was it, Captain Phillips, you get a picture of that world. But piracy used to be things that legitimate governments did. High seas were no man's land. You could steal anything you want. And it would have been considered utopian to try to rule out that practice, but there were international agreements, declarations to stop doing that, and countries stopped doing that. A number of categories of war crimes, such as treatment of prisoners of war, use of poison gas. Again, not exceptionless. We saw in Syria that there can be exceptions, but they are surprisingly few given the temptation and given how toothless these declarations can be. Atmospheric nuclear testing, that even the world's roguest of the rogue states, North Korea, that has consistently given the finger to the rest of the world, has not tested any of its nuclear devices in the atmosphere. So there seems to be some kind of force behind it. Commercial whaling, again, not eliminated, but a fraction of its former use. And I suspect that experts in international relations could come up with other examples. So a declaration is not a reduction, but there are reasons to believe that it is a reasonable start. Interstate war, that is old-fashioned wars, country declares war against another country. As I've mentioned, that's been in sharp decline, and many, even of the most worrisome events in the world, are proceeding the way they do because of a, not quite a taboo, but an enormous reluctance of two countries to go to war with each other. There only are a couple of hundred countries. That's not a whole lot of decision makers, and if war becomes increasingly disgusting, unthinkable, barbaric backwards, it's not unreasonable to think that interstate war could go the way of slave auctions and throwing virgins into volcanoes. Human rights and democracy, there's a question mark there because that is a more difficult process. Again, I think notwithstanding all that we hear about authoritarian capitalist states like Russia and China, they are pretty awful, but if you consider decades rather than years, you realize that if the trajectory from Stalin to Putin or from Mao to the current Chinese regime, the states are enormously more humane. They don't have genocides that kill tens of millions of people or send vast numbers of people to the gulag. So as awful as they are, I think over the long term we're not seeing a reversal, and I suspect that in a span of decades, it's more likely that China will be a little bit more similar to Europe than that Europe will be a little more similar to China. But that is a much more iffy prediction. But then there are some categories of violence which may not decrease anytime soon, where I'm not quite as, I'm not sanguine, but although I'm not totally pessimistic either. Now, as opposed to interstate wars, where you only have to convince a couple of hundred leaders, civil wars are tougher. We have 7 billion people in the world. All it takes is a relatively small number of disgruntled 20-something-year-old men to form the Popular Front for the Liberation of whatever. They have no problem getting their hands on weapons, and they can create a nasty little civil war somewhere. So that, and that's going to be much harder to control by norms, regimes, sanctions, and so on. I'll put a little proviso, a little asterisk there, a little note of optimism against that background of pessimism, which is that in a remarkable study by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, who is here at the conference, they found that contrary to popular belief that violent resistance movements are the only way to overthrow a government, and that Gandhian nonviolent resistance only works against civilized opponents like the British Commonwealth. In fact, the success rate of non-violent resistance movements is at least double that of violent ones. It's not that all the non-violent ones succeed. It's not that all the violent ones fail. But the odds are astonishingly in favor of the nonviolent resistance movements. I would like for their book to be distributed by helicopter over a large surface of the world. If people actually realized what the odds were, then civil wars might be less appealing. In the absence of those helicopters, who knows? Human rights in the Islamic world. Now, another asterisk is that by most quantitative measures, a lot of the Islamic world appears to be sitting out the decline of violence. That is, in wars, terrorist movements, democratization, women's rights, and so on. And it would be hard to say with any degree of confidence that that's going to change soon. But again, I'm going to not repress my inner optimist and mention a reason why we should not necessarily expect the Islamic world to be stuck in the same human rights backwater as so many countries currently are. If you look at slavery, where slavery was first abolished in Northern and Western Europe, it then eventually spread to the northern United States, then to the southern United States, then to Latin America, such as Brazil. And the laggards in this process were a number of Islamic countries. Saudi Arabia and Qatar only abolished slavery in 1962, and Mauritania abolished it only in 1980. But notice that they did eventually abolish it. It took a while, an unconscionably long time, but even the most flagrant violation of human rights could not withstand this global force indefinitely. In addition, there is a fair amount of pent-up demand for human rights and democracy within the Islamic world. Gallup organization did a worldwide survey about 6 or 7 years ago and found that a majority of citizens of even the most repressive Islamic theocracies believe that women should have equal opportunity, that the country should not be governed by clerics. There were highly favorable ratings for not America, but for other Western European democracies like West Germany. They have, these democratic liberal sentiments have been squished between the autocrats and petrocrats and theocrats, but that does exist, and it's been an interesting open question whether forces that seem to be in operation all over the world will penetrate the Islamic world. And I don't think that that is completely dreamy to think about that, although again, I'm not predicting it anytime soon. Another category that I don't think will decline is low-death, high-publicity violence. And there are really two categories. Terrorism, which actually kills a fairly small number of people, but it is, by design, intended to gather huge gobs of publicity, which it does, which is why there are terrorists. And again, as with civil wars, it takes very little to get on the world stage with an act of terrorism. The two pathetic losers in Boston hatched this idiotic scheme to set off a pressure cooker bomb at the Boston Marathon, made news worldwide for literally for years. In a world of 7 billion people, many of whom are disgruntled young men, it would be naive to think that there won't be more Tsarnaev brothers here, there, and everywhere, and so the news will continue to have these attacks almost certainly. Again, I'm sorry, I can't help it, but here's a little optimistic, tiny little asterisk. Terrorism doesn't work. I don't mean that it's immoral. I don't mean that it's barbaric. I just mean terrorists don't get what they want. Again, there are a number of quantitative studies, one by Audrey Cronin, another by Max Abrams, that show that terrorist movements it's a totally idiotic, stupid, self-defeating tactic. It just never works, or very, very, very rarely. If you have a data set of several hundred terrorist movements, you might find one or two that got a little bit of what they wanted. Again, I would love to distribute pamphlets with these studies by helicopter all over the world. In the absence of that, which would just convince would-be terrorists they're not going to get anything, we'll expect to see more of it. And likewise, rampage shootings. What is the, Adam Langford points out, let's say you wanted to become famous. How could you do it? Write a bestseller? Good luck. Everyone writes would-be bestsellers, and very few become bestsellers. Cure a disease? Well, that's not so easy. There is, however, one way in which any person in this room is guaranteed to become famous, and that is kill a large number of innocent people, which is not terribly hard to do. Given that incentive, and again, a world of 7 billion people, as long as the news media continue to make posthumous celebrities out of the pathetic losers who get their guaranteed fame by shooting up a school or shooting up a post office, that's going to continue to happen. Well, the biggest question of all is there a big picture? Is there a grand unified theory as to why we've seen so many declines of violence and why I think there's a reasonable expectation that many will continue? And I think there may be a kind of grand unified theory. It's a little abstract, but I think that it ties the threads together. And that is that violence is what the game theorists call a social dilemma. That is, the problem with violence is that it's always very tempting to exploit someone by harming them, to get something that you want. So the temptations for aggression are always there. But of course, the harm to the victim vastly outweighs the gain to the aggressor. So in the long run, if we could all kind of sit down and figure out the most rational way of living our lives, since today's aggressors can become tomorrow's victims and vice versa, and since violence is a negative-sum game, it really is rational for everyone to agree to abjure from violence. The dilemma is, how do you get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time that you do? Because if you beat your swords into plowshares, but the people next door keep their swords as swords, you could be in big trouble. The trick is you both have to do it simultaneously. And one can well imagine that over the course of human history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually chipped away at this problem, just like we've dealt with other really tough problems like pestilence and hunger. And what all the violence reduction measures that I've measured have in common is they increase the material, emotional, or cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously. So violence reduction may be like other kinds of technological progress, certainly not linear, certainly not inexorable, but on the other hand, not unlikely. So in sum, in the past, many forms of violence, such as homicide, war, corporal and capital punishment, tyranny, violence against women and children, used to be more common than they are now. In the present, human nature continues to include brain systems that can cause violent behavior, such as rage, exploitation, and moralistic violence, particularly dominance and revenge. On the other hand, human nature also contains brain systems that can reduce violence, such as self-control, empathy, norms of behavior, and reason. Violence reduction has consisted of the products of human ingenuity feeding back on norms, on self-control, and on empathy. Violence in the future, with the exception of the death rates from Islamic civil wars, violence has continued to decline since scholars first called attention to the declines. And such progress might continue in some areas: violent crime in states, wars between states, human rights, including violence against women, children, and minorities. It'll be harder to reduce it in others, like civil wars, rampage killings, and terrorism. But overall, I think there is a strong, realistic, non-romantic case for the possibility of future violence reduction. This is not ruled out by even the most jaundiced view of human nature, which I confess to having. It's supported by real and irreversible declines of violence in the past, and it's consistent with other forms of reason-driven progress. Thank you very much. Thank you.